In self-defense, clearly the conclusion that a jury of 6 women came to tonight: George Zimmerman, not guilty. It was a case that was as much about larger issues. It was about guns in this country. It was about race in this country. The Reverend Al Sharpton joins us now. Your reaction?
Well, I think that this is an atrocity. I think that it is probably one of the worst situations that I've seen. What this jury has done is establish a precedent that when you are young and fit a certain profile, you can be committing no crime, just bringing some Skittles and iced tea home to your brother and be killed, and someone can claim self-defense, having been exposed with all kinds of lies, all kinds of inconsistencies. We had to march to even get a trial, and even at trial, when he's exposed over and over again as a liar, he is acquitted. This is a sad day in the country. I think that we clearly must, though, move on to the next step in terms of the federal government and in terms of the civil courts. Clearly, we want people to be very disciplined and strategic, but this is a slap in the face to those that believe in justice in this country.
Joy-Ann Reid, you spent time down in that community. You talked to many of the people who were intimately involved. You walked in that neighborhood. You saw where Trayvon Martin died. Your reaction?
Well, I mean, I have 2 reactions. One, we talked a little bit earlier about the social pressures on these jurors. I mean, these were 5 white women. The other juror of indeterminate race, I guess we're going to say. It's kind of remarkable that in 2013 we still aren't sure of people's race, but that's what we're going with. And they had to go home to a community in Sanford that was split along racial lines, where white Sanford residents were by and large supporting George Zimmerman. In a lot of ways, it's a conservative community. Supporting George Zimmerman has become something of a matter of conservative dogma. You saw gun owners, people who are politically conservative, supporting him. He raised $300,000. That didn't come from no one. It came from people who were fervently believing in his defense, one of whom testified, bought him his clothes. So I think that those jurors also had to be mindful of going home to their community and how they would explain convicting George Zimmerman. And I think those social pressures existed too. We just never talked about them. But really, for a moment, just to talk about Black Sanford, and not only Black Sanford, but African Americans who are texting me now, tweeting me now, there has been a sense of demoralization and really depression about this case from the very beginning. The notion that a young Black man's life really isn't worth much in America was tied up in this case. And the notion that this boy just walking home was out of place just by being there, just by being dressed the way he was. Just his existence was almost illegal, such that someone acting sort of in the guise of a police officer, but with no authority given to him by the law, could question, detain, follow, shoot, and kill a young Black man and not even be arrested, just be sent home. So I think that a lot of African Americans in Sanford, this is going to double them down on their feelings about the Sanford police, about the justice system, about really not counting, not mattering. You know, I had a young man from Sanford actually texting me while we were on the air who was saying the tension was so thick he couldn't stand it. Because I think for a lot of African Americans, this is a moment when the country sends them a message. And the message it sent is, you know what? It's okay to shoot and kill one of your sons because it really just doesn't matter that much. And unfortunately, that's the message that I'm getting back from a lot of people who are really depressed, not just African Americans. There are white, Black, Hispanic people who are just saying to me, I'm depressed. I feel down. This hurts. And I think it's going to hurt for a long time.
And we see the reaction of George Zimmerman's family. There are tears, hugs, and smiles. But outside, a crowd that has been there through much of this night, and most of them supporters of Trayvon Martin. Let me go to Craig Melvin and get a sense of what the reaction was there when the verdict was heard.
We listened very closely to that crowd that's been gathered outside the courthouse, Chris Jansen, for all day and much of yesterday as well. When that verdict was read at 9:59 p.m., silence. You could not, we didn't even hear a gasp. There was a silence, and shortly thereafter we started to hear some sirens as well. But right now we just looked over there. They're still there. The folks who've gathered there are still hanging out outside the courthouse, but no chanting, no singing. We did note during the reading of that verdict George Zimmerman's family, all sitting there. They were holding hands across the row. They were crying at one point. Their hands were locked. George Zimmerman as well, his demeanor different, obviously, than it had been during much of the trial. George Zimmerman did not express a great deal of emotion at any point during the trial. We saw him take several deep breaths before that verdict was read, and shortly after, when I say shortly, I mean probably 90 seconds after the verdict was read, he was laughing with his attorneys, hugging, shaking hands, smiling, appeared to be tremendously relieved. Also right now, we can tell you that we hear some choppers above us. Those are, and folks at home who may hear those as well, those are news helicopters. Those are not law enforcement helicopters. A number of news helicopters who have obviously been covering this story extensively for the past 17 months as well. They've had choppers up much of the evening. But you can see from this vantage point, Chris, that the crowd that had been assembled there, they are starting to leave peacefully, we should note. They are starting to presumably head home.
And also those choppers, they have very specific instructions to keep their cameras off of the back of that criminal court building, that it is the right of these jurors, if they choose to leave and not come to the microphones, to do so at this point. Reverend Al, you said that now we have to move forward, but what is the next step after this?
Well, I certainly will be convening a conference call of those of us that have protested this from the beginning. Their legal steps forward is that the family has a civil suit that now I'm sure will fast forward. Zimmerman will have to testify in that suit, and he will be confronted with these inconsistencies and possibly could say things that could lead to new evidence. The federal government, the Justice Department, suspended its investigation, is my understanding. We will probably be calling on them now to remove that suspension and move forward with their investigation to see if there's civil rights violations. Clearly, we will be moving in the next few hours to where the next steps will be.
Again, we don't know whether the jurors will come to the microphone or if at what point they may answer any questions. But Lisa Bloom, what question do you have? What do you want to know from them about how they came to this conclusion?
Well, let me just give you my legal assessment of this. Unlike Reverend Al, who labored valiantly with the family from the beginning to make this happen, I came into this case with basically a clean slate. I didn't know much about it other than what I'd read in the papers. And I've watched this trial minute by minute, day by day. Reverend Al knows I was on his show every day, that early on I thought the prosecution was not doing such a great job. By the end of the prosecution case, I thought they had improved. They'd put on some good witnesses. But by the end of the defense case, I had a lot of sharp criticisms for the prosecution in this case, and particularly in closing arguments. I was really surprised at how weak the prosecution was, if I may be honest, in closing arguments. I think the prosecution team was clearly out-lawyered by the defense team, and I think the evidence was there to convict, if not of second-degree murder, certainly of manslaughter. But the prosecution team, in making some very odd decisions in the way that they put this case in, and particularly in closing argument, asking questions and using a lot of maybes and mights rather than connecting the dots, leaving a very wide door open for the defense to say this is a reasonable doubt case. And I know these prosecutors practice down there, and I thought perhaps that was a strategy that was unique to them, but it was really very surprising to me. This prosecution team missed a lot in this case. They missed the fact that George Zimmerman, when he said his head was being pounded on the cement, he was actually on the grass many feet away from the cement. That was not pointed out in closing argument. They missed, until closing argument, the placement of the gun behind George Zimmerman inside his pants. They mentioned it for the first time in closing argument and really just glossed over it and moved on. That should have been a central point that was really pounded on. They missed the fact that Trayvon Martin was wearing a hoodie with a sweatshirt underneath, which explains why it would be separated a little bit from his body, even if he were in a standing position. And that was an important defense argument. They refused to address the issue of race. They hid from the issue of race while the defense addressed it squarely, and they never offered a theory of the case. So when I was asked to call it, as I think many legal pundits were, everyone said that we expected this to be a defense verdict. But I want to emphasize to everybody listening, that doesn't mean the evidence wasn't there. I can't explain why the prosecution in this case made the decisions that they made, but this was a very predictable outcome just watching the court case.
We are less than 2 minutes away, we are told, from the state attorney coming to the microphone and reacting to this. But I think if we can briefly, Joanne, it is worth making at least a statement about, does this speak to a larger issue of race in America and our perceptions of young black men who have a hoodie up and are walking through a neighborhood? Is it about the prosecution? Is it about this jury? Do we know?
Well, I think this is the reason why you need to make sure the juries are balanced more by race. I mean, you had, in this case, jurors, none of whom clearly is a young black man who has had that experience of walking through a store and having people follow you around, or walking around just being yourself, wearing, you know, whatever it is you want to wear, and being seen as dangerous when, you know, the white owner of Facebook, the guy who founded Facebook, could go in a hoodie onto the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and not be seen as somehow thuggish or criminal. And I remind everyone that, again, you had a jury from Sanford, and Sanford is a very conservative, high level of gun ownership. Two of these jurors were gun owners, and there was a fealty to the notion that a gun owner should be able to carry, should be able to concealed carry. There is that fealty to that notion in Florida, and a severe protection in the law for the discharge of a firearm in that state. Florida is a state that is essentially run by the NRA. The lobbyists for the NRA, people call them the de facto governor of Florida. It's a gun state, and if you discharge your firearm, you are going to get a lot of support in Florida. And if you cull a jury, no African Americans on it, you're not really going to get people who sympathize with the life experience of Trayvon Martin or his family. So I never thought you had a case that was built for the Martin family. It was never built to sympathize with their experience or with Trayvon. And the first time that the prosecution really brought home that emotional context for the death of this boy was in John Guy's closing. That's when he finally forced everyone to look at the emotional center of the case, which was a young man whose last act on earth, as John Guy said, was to try to get home. It was the first time the prosecution did that. And I think I'm with Lisa on, there were a lot of mistakes made, a lot of courses not taken, conceding Trayvon Martin on the top and George Zimmerman on the bottom. Sounds like a huge mistake in retrospect. Not litigating the notion of why did George Zimmerman get out of his car, which everybody talked about like every day, including on social media, but they didn't do it. So I think the prosecutors will go back and look at what they did, and they've got to find a lot of mistakes that they made, and you know what? They can't appeal. And they have simply lost.
And Joy, to your point, there's a reason why African Americans are underrepresented, not only on this jury, but on almost every jury in America, and that's because of felony disenfranchisement laws, which means that convicted felons cannot serve on juries. And in some states, that's as many as 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 African American men. So across the board, African Americans are underrepresented on juries, and African Americans are overrepresented as defendants, meaning they're far less likely to get a jury of their peers. I just wanted to say that. It's not just this case.
And far more represented in incarceration. Even John Guy said.
We're going to go and listen to the state's attorney now, and we'll come back to Reverend Al. But let's listen to their reaction to the not guilty verdict in the case against George Zimmerman.